Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about Jesus' comparison in Matthew 24 of the second coming to the flood. Opponents of preterism often cite this passage as proof that Jesus could not have come in AD 70. After all, Jesus compared a second coming to the flood, which was a global event, yet there was no global event or global judgment in the year AD 70. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the term preterism, preterism is the view that the second coming happened in AD 70. This view is based on passages such as Matthew 16:28, in which Jesus told his disciples, "There are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." This is Matthew 16, verse 28. So Jesus was basically saying there are some standing here right in front of him that will not taste death or will not die till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You can also see similar statements in Matthew 10, verse 23, and Matthew 24, verse 30 to 34, and Matthew 26, verse 64. Just to name a few passages. And by the way, I'm going to talk more about these passages in a little bit. Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to address one of the most, often cited objections to preterism, which is that, how could the second coming have happened in AD 70 when Jesus compared it to the flood, which was a global event? So since there was no global flood-like event in AD 70, then, the second coming obviously could not have happened. Okay, so let me first start by reading Matthew 24, verse 37 to 39, in which Jesus says, quote, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, up until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." End quote. This is from Matthew 24, verse 37 to 39. So in this passage, Jesus compared his second coming to the flood in Noah's day. Moreover, Jesus had just said in the previous verse, and this is verse 36, quote, "But of that day and hour nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only." And again, this is verse 36. And as I just read, Jesus said that this coming would happen when people were least expecting it, just like in Noah's day when people were marrying and given in marriage, right up until the flood came and took them all away. So opponents of preterism say that this passage, shows that preterism cannot possibly be true because, Jesus compared his second coming to the flood, which was a global event. That would be a total surprise to everybody. But I disagree with that view for a number of reasons, and I'm going to go over these reasons right now. Okay, first, regarding the timing issue, contrary to popular opinion, the second coming was never supposed to be a surprise for believers. That's right, you heard correct. The timing of the second coming was never supposed to be a surprise for believers. Now, it's true that Jesus did not know the exact day and hour, as I just read, but he certainly knew it would happen within a generation because he said so over and over and over. As I just read in Matthew 16, verse 28, Jesus said to the people of his day, "There are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So it had to happen within the lifetimes of Jesus' audience. In another passage, Jesus told his apostles that they would not finish preaching throughout the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. This is Matthew 10, verse 23. By the way, Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So how long would it take to preach throughout New Jersey, the cities of New Jersey? Not very long. And Jesus said he would come before they finished preaching throughout the cities of Israel. So, he must have come a long time ago. It doesn't take 2,000 years to preach through the cities of Israel. In another passage, Jesus said he would come on clouds within this generation. This is Matthew 24, verses 30 to 34. So Jesus said he would come within this generation or his generation. By the way, a biblical generation equals around 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verses 8 to 10, or Numbers 14, verses 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. So Jesus said during his earthly ministry, which would have been in around the year AD 30, that the Son of Man would come on clouds within this generation, or 40 years. So it must have happened by around the year AD 70. One more passage I want to read, Matthew 24, verse 64. Jesus told the high priest and the Jewish Sanhedrin, this happened during his trial when, the high priest and the Sanhedrin were questioning him. Jesus told the high priest Caiaphas and the rest of the Jewish Sanhedrin that they would see him coming on clouds. This is Matthew 24, verse 64. In other words, it would happen within their lifetimes. They would witness it. At least some of the Sanhedrin would still be alive. I know Caiaphas wasn't alive, but the rest of the Sanhedrin, at least some of them who he was speaking to were still alive in AD 70. So Jesus may not have known the exact day and hour, but he certainly knew it would happen within the lifetimes of the people he was talking to in the first century. It would happen within their generation. And he said so over and over and over. And his apostles knew this too. And we can be sure of this because James said in approximately the year AD 60, keep in mind this was written around 30 years after Jesus said those things, which I just read. So by this time, James said, quote, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Behold, the judge is standing by the door. This is James 5, verses 8 to 9. So by this point in time, by the year AD 60, the coming of the Lord was at hand. The judge was, standing by the door. It was about to happen. Likewise, the writer of Hebrews said in approximately the year AD 62 that Jesus would come, quote, in a little while. You can read this in Hebrews 10, verse 37. Actually, the literal Greek is in a very little while. So Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, some people say it was Paul, probably was Paul, but whoever wrote Hebrews said, Jesus would come in a little while, not, 2,000 years. Paul likewise said in Philippians 4, verse 5, that the Lord is at hand. So, the second coming was never supposed to be a surprise to Jesus' disciples. They did not know the exact day and hour, but they sure knew it would happen within their generation, and they said so over and over and over. Keep in mind also that even back in Noah's day, Noah and his family knew full well that the flood was coming soon, even though they did not know the exact day and hour. That's why they built the ark. They didn't just build this ark for the fun of it. They built it in anticipation of a soon coming judgment. In fact, even the wicked people of that day, of Noah's day, should have known that this judgment was coming soon. How? Because there was a gigantic ark sitting in the middle of the desert. The completed ark was the unmistakable sign of imminent judgment. Yet the wicked people of Noah's day just laughed and scoffed instead. This was Jesus' point in comparing the second coming to the flood in Noah's day. Jesus was warning the people of his day not to be caught unaware like the unbelievers and the scoffers in Noah's day, who ignored the unmistakable sign, the gigantic ark sitting in the middle of the desert. And they continued living their lives as if all was well, marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the time that the flood came and took them all away. And just like that gigantic ark sitting in the middle of the desert in Noah's day, there were unmistakable signs of imminent judgment in Jesus' day too. In fact, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees of his day for not recognizing those blatant signs all around them. Here's what Jesus said to the Pharisees, quote, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. This is Matthew 16, verse 3. So Jesus rebuked the Pharisees of his day for not discerning the signs of the times, that were all around them. What were these signs of the times? The miracles, the signs and wonders that were happening all around them. For example, Jesus raised people from the dead, and, not to mention Jesus' own resurrection. Jesus also restored, sight to the blind. He fed, 5,000 plus people with 5 loaves and, 2 fish. The apostles also did similar kinds of miracles. So the signs of the times were everywhere. And of all the people that were alive in that time period, the Jewish leaders who knew the scriptures best should have recognized that the times that they were living in. After all, their very scriptures foretold, for example, in Joel 2, verse 28 to 32, that in the last days there would be miraculous signs and wonders, which would be followed by the great and awesome day of the Lord. In fact, in Acts 2, during Pentecost, Peter cited Joel's prophecy in its entirety. I mean, he read the whole prophecy. Here's what Peter said on Pentecost. By the way, if you remember what happened on Pentecost, there was a bunch of miraculous signs and wonders. There was a sound of a great wind and rushing water. Fire descended on people. There were people speaking in tongues. So all kinds of miraculous signs happened on Pentecost. And here's what Peter said about this event. Quote, "This is what was spoken by Joel the prophet." In other words, Peter was citing Joel's prophecy. And then Peter went on to say, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that I will pour my spirit out on all flesh." And this is God talking, by the way. "I will pour my spirit out on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also my men servants and my maid servants, I will pour out my Holy Spirit in those days." He's talking about miracles here. "I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." This is Acts 2, verses 17 to 21. Again, Peter was quoting from Joel 2, verses 28 to 32. So, as this passage says, that in the last days there would be signs and wonders or miracles, which would be followed by the great and awesome day of the Lord. So because all of the miraculous signs and wonders that were happening in the first century, in Jesus' day, the Jewish leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, should have been the first to recognize the times that they were living in. They should have known that they were living in the last days. And by the way, when I say last days, I mean the last days of the Old Covenant age, not the last days of planet Earth. So the, scribes and Pharisees, because of all the miracles happening, they should have known that they were living in the last days, but they turned a blind eye instead. As Jesus said, they refused to believe. They had eyes but could not see. They had ears but could not hear. You can see this in Matthew 11, verse 15, or in Romans 11, verse 8. You can also see that in Acts 28, verses 27. Jesus' apostles, on the other hand, did recognize the signs or the times that they were living in. That's why Peter quoted, Joel's last day prophecy and then said, quote, "This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." This is Acts 2, verse 16, as I just read. So in doing this, Peter was warning the people of his day in no uncertain terms that the last days, which were prophesied by Joel, had finally arrived, which meant that the great and awesome day of the Lord could not be far behind, as it says in Joel's prophecy. In fact, Jesus too alluded to Joel's last days prophecy in the Olivet Discourse. If you remember in Matthew 24, verse 2, Jesus said that not one stone of the temple will remain upon another. Then in verse 3, the disciples ask about the end of the age, aka the last days. And then Jesus mentions all the precursors that would happen, false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, tribulation. And then Jesus says in verse 29, quote, "The sun, moon, and stars will, turn to darkness, which will be followed by the coming of the Lord." You can see that in verse 30. So Jesus was alluding to Joel's last days prophecy. They both mention the end of the age, or the last days. They both mention the sun, moon, and stars growing dim. And then they both mention, the great and awesome day of the Lord, or the coming of the Lord, as Jesus put it. And when did Jesus say that this would happen? Jesus went on to say a couple verses later, quote, "Assuredly I say to you," and remember, he's still talking to his disciples, This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. This is Matthew 24:34. In fact, Jesus specifically linked it to the destruction of the temple. I mean, that was the original question, right? When Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another, and then the disciples asked when it will happen. So Jesus was telling, then he listed all these things. So Jesus was telling his disciples when this event would happen. So Jesus and Peter knew full well that they were living in the last days because of all the miracles, right? And of all people, the scribes and Pharisees, or the Jewish leaders of that day, should have known, from the Old Testament that they were living in the last days. But as Jesus said, they turned a blind eye, to everything that was going on. They didn't want to know, basically, because they liked the situation that they were in. They were respected. People called them rabbis. They walked around in nice robes. They got the best seats in synagogues. So, they didn't want things to change, the scribes and Pharisees and the Jewish leaders. They liked things as they were. Okay, so here are some other passages I want to read that show that Jesus' apostles knew that they were living in the last days. In approximately the year AD 57, Paul said, quote, "Now all these things happened to them," and by the way, he's referring to the Israelites in Moses' day. So now all these things happened to them, the Israelites in Moses' day, as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And remember, Paul was talking to Christians in his day, so they were written for our admonition, in other words, for the people in Paul's day, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. This is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. The writer of Hebrews likewise said in approximately the year AD 62 that God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. This is Hebrews 1, verses 1 to 2. So Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews was saying, he said these last days, in other words, his days. So he was living in the last days. In another passage that was spoken around the same time period, AD 62, this is again the writer of Hebrews. He said that, quote, "But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." And this is obviously referring to Jesus. So once again, but now once at the end of the ages. So the end of the ages had arrived, according to Hebrews 9, verse 26. Peter, too, said in, approximately AD 60, he said, quote, "The end of all things is at hand." This is 1 Peter 4, verse 7. So can there be any doubt that, the apostles believed they were living in the last days? In fact, by the time the later New Testament epistles were written in the, mid-60s, it was no longer even the last days anymore. By this time, it was the last hour of the last day. Here's what John said in approximately AD 65, quote, "Little children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come, by which we know it is the last hour." This is 1 John 2, verse 18. So by this time, it was not even the last day anymore. It was the last hour of the last day. And by the way, Antichrists were people in the first century who denied that Jesus was the Messiah. You can read this in 1 John 2, verse 22 to 23, or 1 John 4, verse 2 to 3, or 2 John 7. So Antichrists were people who, denied that Jesus was the Messiah. So these passages clearly show that, the last days had arrived. And I'm referring to the last days of the Old Covenant age, not the last days of planet Earth. And of all people, the Jewish leaders should have been the first to recognize it. But, they mocked and they scoffed instead, just like the scoffers in Noah's day. So this was Jesus' point in comparing the second coming to the judgment in Noah's day. Jesus was warning the people of his day, in the first century, to keep watch because there was, in essence, a gigantic ark sitting in the middle of the desert, the miracles that were happening, which meant that a cataclysmic judgment was about to come. In other words, the great and awesome day of the Lord was about to come. It was about to happen. And this judgment did happen, by the way, in the year AD 70. And within 40 years of Jesus, making those predictions or those prophecies about, the coming of the Lord, within 40 years, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. According to the first century historian Josephus, 1.1 million Jews were killed, another 97,000 were taken into slavery. So Jesus came on clouds of glory, or in clouds of judgment, just like he had warned. By the way, that's what a cloud coming refers to, a judgment. In fact, God the Father in the Old Testament came on clouds numerous times, and these cloud comings referred to judgments. You can see this in Isaiah 19:1, or Ezekiel 32, verse 7 to 15, or Psalms 18, verse 7 to 17. So when Jesus used the same, coming on clouds language that was used in the Old Testament, he meant it the same way. And what he meant was that a judgment was coming, a cataclysmic judgment was coming. And that judgment happened exactly in the time frame that Jesus, laid out. For more information about this topic, by the way, I'll leave a link to my video called What is a Coming of the Lord in the video notes below, so you can check that out if you're interested. Okay, so let me move on to my second point now, which has to do with Jesus comparing, the second coming to the flood. And my point is this, that it's true that Jesus compared his second coming to the flood, but the flood was a local event, not a global event. I realize this is a controversial statement in some Christian circles, but I think the evidence clearly shows that, that the flood was a local event, not a global event. In fact, I think Jesus believed that too, because Jesus not only compared a second coming to the flood in Noah's day, but he also compared it to the judgment of Sodom, which was a local judgment. If you guys remember the story in Genesis 19, where God warns that he's going to judge Sodom. And so the angel tells Lot and his family to flee the area, and they do flee. And as a result, they, avoided this judgment. Well, didn't go so good for Lot's wife, but because she looked back. But the rest of the family, they avoided this judgment. So Jesus compared his second coming not only to the flood in Noah's day, but he also compared it to the judgment of Sodom, which was a local judgment. Here's what Jesus said in Luke 17, verse 26 to 30. Quote, "As it was in the days of Noah, the flood, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man, the second coming. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it also was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so, it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." He's talking about his second coming. By the way, this is Luke 17, verse 26 to 30. So Jesus compared his second coming not only to the flood, but he also compared it to the judgment of Sodom. And this judgment of Sodom was, a local judgment. It was avoidable by fleeing the area, like Lot and his family did. In fact, in Luke 21, verse 20 to 21, Jesus, when he was describing a second coming, he specifically told his disciples to flee Jerusalem, or flee Judah when they saw the armies surrounding Jerusalem. So Jesus clearly believed that, his second coming would be avoidable, just like in Sodom's day, by fleeing the area. And as I just read in Luke 17, Jesus not only compared his second coming to the flood in Noah's day, but he also compared it to the judgment of Sodom, which was avoidable by fleeing the area. Now, a possible objection to this that I often get is that if the flood was local, why did Genesis 6 verses 13 to 18, for example, describe the flood as being a judgment of all the earth and all flesh? This just sounds so global, a lot of people say. And admittedly, I agree, it does sound global. But these kinds of, biblical descriptions are often apocalyptic language or hyperbole. And they often refer to local geographical areas. Let me give you some examples. In the New Testament book of Luke, Luke describes the annual census that, the Roman Empire took in Jesus' day, for tax purposes. And it says in Luke 2, verse 1 to 2, quote, "It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus," and this was the Roman Empire, by the way, "that all the world should be registered, for the census." This is, again, Luke 2, verse 1 to 2. So just like in Genesis, it uses the words all the world. However, this census of all the world did not include the Chinese or the Aborigines in Australia or the East Africans, even though the Roman Empire, the Romans knew full well that these people existed. Caesar Augustus's world was the Roman Empire, not the entire planet. And that's the world that he taxed. Likewise, Paul said in approximately the year AD 60, and keep in mind this was about 10 years before the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, and Paul said that the gospel had already gone out to all the world. Here's what Paul said, quote, "The truth of the gospel which has come to you, as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit." This is Colossians 1, verse 6. So Paul said that the gospel had gone out to all the world. And this was 10 years before the fall of Jerusalem in the year AD 60. So Paul was clearly referring to the Roman Empire, not the entire planet. In another passage, this time from the Old Testament, Jeremiah describes the judgment of Jerusalem and the various other nations in the same way that Genesis described the flood. Here's what Jeremiah said, quote, "The Lord will roar on high and utter his voice from his holy habitation. He will roar mightily against his fold. He will give a shout as those who tread the grapes against all the inhabitants of the earth. A noise will come to the ends of the earth, for the Lord has a controversy with the nations. He will plead his case with all flesh. He will give those who are wicked to the sword, says the Lord." This is Jeremiah 25, verse 30 to 31. So Jeremiah said that this judgment would be against all the inhabitants of the earth. And he said God would plead his case with all flesh. This is the exact same kind of language that Genesis, uses to describe the flood. Yet Jeremiah was describing the judgment of Jerusalem, Edom, and various other nations, which took place in approximately the year 600 BC. In fact, God used the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument of justice. You can read this in Jeremiah 25, verses 9 to 21. In another Old Testament prophecy, Zephaniah warned, quote, "Near is the day of the Lord, and all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy, for he will make a complete end, indeed a terrifying one, of all the inhabitants of the earth," end quote. This is Zephaniah 1, verses 14 to 18. So despite all this, global sounding language and apocalyptic language, this was a passage or a prophecy against the judgment of Jerusalem that was fulfilled in 586 BC. One more example. In a passage about the judgment of Jerusalem in, again, 586 BC, God said, quote, "My sword shall go out of its sheath against all flesh from south to north, that all flesh may know that I am the Lord. I have drawn my sword out of its sheath, it shall not return anymore." This is Ezekiel 21, verse 4. So once again, the term all flesh is used to describe the judgment of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So all these many examples show that, terms such as all the earth and all flesh do not always literally refer to the entire planet or to all people. And this should not be all that shocking, by the way. I mean, we today speak like this too. How many times have we heard people say, has the whole world gone mad? Or how many times have we heard people say, like, she rocked my world? We use hyperbole like this all the time. All the time. That, pun intended. So we use language like this today all the time, hyperbole like this, and so did the, biblical writers. Therefore, given all the hyperbolic uses of all the earth and all flesh all throughout the Bible, we cannot just assume that these terms were intended literally when describing the flood. We need more evidence, either biblical or scientific, to reach a informed conclusion. And when we look at the evidence, it points to a local judgment, not a global one. Regarding the biblical evidence, as I just mentioned, Jesus compared the flood to the judgment of Sodom, which was a local event that could be avoided by fleeing the area. And you can read this again in Luke 17:29 to 30. So it seems that even Jesus believed the flood was a local event. Now, regarding the scientific evidence, let's just say that the evidence for a global flood is scant. In an article by the Christian apologetics organization Reasons to Believe, called "Is the Global Flood Scientifically Possible?" the author points out that there's not enough water on the planet to cover the tops of the mountains. Think about Mount Everest, which is, about 29,000 feet high, right? About 5.5 miles high, Mount Everest, or above sea level, I should say. So to cover the tops of this mountain, it would take 75% more water that is currently available on the entire planet. Moreover, Mount Everest is rising only 4 millimeters per year, which equates to about 125 feet over the last 10,000 years, or 500 feet over the last 40,000 years. So reversing this trend would make almost no difference. There's just not enough water on the planet to cover the mountains. Now, global flood proponents sometimes argue that the mountains back in Noah's day were, much flatter, which made it possible for the water to cover the earth. They argue that God's judgment caused a massive and quick, within a year or so, uplifting of the mountains, which accounts for the sudden change in the earth's topography. However, that theory is dubious. To begin with, the tectonic forces required to cause such a massive mountain-building event in a single year would have been so violent and caused so much turbulence in the water that Noah's Ark would likely have been torn apart or capsized. And while Genesis 7, verse 17 to 20 speaks of the water increasing and rising greatly, it makes no mention of violent or turbulent motions in the seas. Similarly, Genesis 8, verse 1 to 5 says the water receded, but once again, it makes no mention of violence or turbulence. Moreover, if the global flood happened, there would be evidence for it. Yet, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, there isn't any evidence for a global flood. The article I just mentioned by Reasons to Believe sums it up nicely. Quote, "In order to reconcile a global flood view with the current scientific evidence, one must accept a number of difficult to believe claims. Either one, the global topography was similar to today's, but the water used to cover the globe no longer resides on Earth or is hidden from our discovery. Or two, the water on Earth today was sufficient to cover the globe, but the tectonic forces completely altered the topography of the globe in a way that is not detectable to us." End quote. So given the evidence, both scientific and biblical, it seems unlikely that the flood was a global event. It was most likely a local event. Besides all this, many theologians argue that at the time of the flood, humanity was confined to the Fertile Crescent, the crescent-shaped region in the Middle East, which means God did not have to flood the entire planet to judge humanity. All he had to do was flood the Fertile Crescent area. Okay, so the evidence shows that the flood, was in all likelihood a local event, not a global one. And since Jesus compared a second coming to the flood, therefore the second coming must have been a local event too. One last point I want to make about all this. It's true that Jesus said his second coming would be like the flood in Noah's day, in Matthew 24, verse 37. However, Jesus also said a mere 3 verses earlier, in verse 34, that it would happen within a generation, that his second coming would happen within a generation. Therefore, since Jesus said this in approximately the year AD 30, then it must have happened by about AD 70. And it did happen. This timing fits perfectly with the events of AD 70, when the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. It's also interesting that Christians fled the area just like Jesus told them to do when they saw the city of Jerusalem surrounded by armies. and as a result, they avoided this judgment. Here's a quote by theologian Adam Clarke in his commentary on Matthew. Quote, "It is very remarkable that not a single Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, though there were many there when Cestus Gallus invaded the city." Cestus Gallus was a Roman general who, led the troops to destroy Jerusalem. Okay, so Adam Clarke goes on to say, "All who believed in Christ left Jerusalem and fled to Pella and other places beyond the river Jordan, and so they all marvelously escaped the general shipwreck of their country. Not one of them perished," end quote. So the Christians fled the area just like Jesus told them to do, and as a result, they avoided this judgment. And this is a judgment Jesus compared to the flood in Noah's day. And also, which, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, he compared to the judgment of Sodom. So I think the biblical and scientific evidence points to a local flood, not a global flood. And by the way, if you want more information about this topic, the flood in Genesis, there's a great book I recommend called Beyond Creation Science by Timothy Martin and Jeff Vaughn. They go into much more detail about this topic. Really good book. Also, if you want more information about the topic of the end times in general, you can get my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. I go over the topic of the end times in detail, so you can get my book if you're interested. Or you can just visit my website, thebiblefulfilled.com. I have a bunch of free articles and videos there. So check that out too if you're interested. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please do me a favor, hit the like button. If you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. Okay, so again, thanks for watching this video and have a great week, and I will see you next time.